We have reached the summit of our evening tonight, where we have our toast to the immortal memory of Robert Burns. I've known Frank Shaw for many years, as many of you have, here as a member of the Burns Club. He's also the current president of the Atlanta St. Andrew Society, which several of us here are also members of. Frank and I, we're all interested in Burns here, but Frank and I share an interest with many of you here in collecting the ephemera of Burns, the Burnsiana, we call it, those things about Burns, about his life and the works of Burns. And that's something, again, as librarian here in the club, I've had to share. It's been one of the rewarding aspects of being a member here. And so that's why, again, it was my turn to pick the speakers this year, and that's why I picked Frank Shaw to give our toast to the immortal memory. Frank Shaw.
Paul, thank you for that. According to what you had to say, I can speak to 12 o'clock. I want to tell you that Thomas Keith, who spoke here 2 years ago, sent an email saying hello. Ross Roy, in a phone conversation, said the same, and to tell you that he was getting some more books up for the Burns Club. Thinks very highly of this club. Walter Watson, our speaker last year, who was then president of the Burns Federation, said in an email, Liz and I were treated so royally by the club and individual members. Say hello to President Victor. While unable to be with you all this year and to join hands, we're with you in heart and spirits. Jim Henderson, the secretary of the London Burns Club, informed me that 12 members walked over to the Victorian Embankment Gardens on the 25th of this week to lay a wreath at the great man's feet. Jack Hume, who has spoken here before and borrowed the bust in the back to have one made for the gardens there, the park, sent a card that said best wishes, and then a little note at the bottom said, it is tough to deliver a message to your own club. Well, I don't know about that because I found you all to be a very gracious audience over the years. 2 times I've spoken to you before. One thing I've learned about you is that you're a great people, and it holds true about the old adage that all people make me happy, and this is particularly true with members of this club, and you make me happy. Some of you when you enter and some of you when you leave. There was Sandy, a resident of a small Scottish village, who died after many years of life. His wife, his widow Maggie, made her way down the mountains to the publisher to tell the publisher she wanted an obituary or death notice printed. And she said, just print Sandy died. Everybody knew it, just say Sandy died. The perplexed publisher, just newly out of school and in the village, said, that's it, Sandy died. Surely after living all these years, you can think of something better to say than just Sandy died. And if it's the price of this obituary notice, just keep in mind that the first 5 words are free. So she looked down at the ground and looked back up in just a moment, and she said, okay then, let's print Sandy died, kilt for sale. A few years ago, another man named Burns died. His name was George. And I've always loved his definition of happiness. Happiness, George Burns says, is a good martini, a good meal, a good cigar, a good woman, or, if you're lucky, a bad woman. And the last one, before we get into the meat of the little talk tonight, this lady walks into the pharmacy. She tells the pharmacist that she wants some cyanide to poison her husband. He quickly lets her know that he cannot give her cyanide. That's against the law. He'd lose his license, and they'd put him in jail, and all kinds of bad things would happen. He said, what on earth is wrong with you? There's absolutely no way I can sell you cyanide. The little lady reached inside of her jacket and pulled out a picture. This picture was a picture of her husband in bed with the pharmacist's wife. The pharmacist looked at the picture and replied, "Well, now, you didn't tell me you had a prescription." I'm going to look down more than normally because it's bad light in here, Paul. You're not the only one who can't see. It is not for me to stand here tonight to tell you the old story of Burns. You've heard it before. You've heard it many times before. But I'm just going to tell you some little anecdotes that I've run across over the years of reading about Burns. It is said by some detractors that Burns is more praised than read. Some even charge that he is the most recited poet by drunk men. A favorite whipping post by his critics happens to be Burns clubs and Burns suppers. They maintain that most meet to eat and drink again. Similarly, meeting once a year, some of them, like the crowd who runs over to church on Easter. Hugh McDermott, who was such a great poet himself, a.k.a. known as Christopher Murray Grieve, once said that to create the kind of Scotland that Burns worked for, Burns would have to be forgotten for a quarter of a century. It is this same poet that has repeated this statement that he would be willing to sacrifice 1 million people for one immortal lyric. It was McDermott who espoused the "not Burns but back to Dunbar" slogan and went around saying it for years. He trained as a school teacher. This same man was expelled for stealing books. He caught on with the Edinburgh Evening News. He was fired for selling books that he had been given to review. Much later, he became a card-carrying communist. Ross Roy, who knows him, or did know him before his death, told me this week that McDermott would wear a bright red tie. And he said he just felt like he was doing it to bait him, to get him to say something about being a communist. And in that gravelly voice of Ross Roy, he said, "I never took the bait." This man had some tragedy in his life. He lost his wife and 2 children to a coal merchant. He fell off, truly, he fell off of a double-decker bus in London, landing on his head. Miraculously lived, but had problems for a long time. In 1958, though, he helped do something that startled people, in that he formed, with some others, the 200 Burns Club at Milner's Bar in Edinburgh. He delivered the Immortal memory on BBC in the bicentenary of Burns Supper. So he did an about face. Now let's look at some other little anecdotes. October 1786 in the Edinburgh Magazine. "Who are you, Mr. Burns? At what university have you been educated? What language do you understand? What authors have you studied? Who has praised your poems and under whose patronage are they published? In short, what qualifies you, Mr. Burns, to entitle you to instruct or entertain us?" So we will borrow from the publisher and ask the question, "Who are you, Mr. Burns?" Carol McGirt, those of you who were at the 80th anniversary of celebration of Ross Roy's party in Columbia 2 years ago, met her, simply summed it up in the best way I've ever seen. She has written several books on Burns. Robert Burns is the only great poet ever to emerge from the British peasant class. But yet he must have done something right, because 10,000 people showed up at his funeral. I've even read accounts where it was 12,000. But before we get too cocky about that, just this past month, George Best, anybody know George Best? Oh. The footballer? They were anticipating 500,000 people to show up at his. So we can't get too cocky about that, okay? So who are you, Mr. Burns, that the libraries at the Mitchell in Glasgow and the Thomas Cooper Library over in Columbia, South Carolina, with the Ross Roy collection, has over 5,000 Burns books in their stacks. What do we call you, Mr. Burns? Your dear friend William Nicol once addressed you in a letter as "Dear Christless Bobby." Known to us as Bobby? I don't think so. The gifted and irascible Latin master that Burns named the child after is the same man who called him Christless Bobby. His casual friends called Burns Robbie or Robert. Those closer called him Rob, Rab, Rabby, or Robin. And in this situation where he was called Bobby, I just thought it was interesting that it caused a minor scandal later because he was called Bobby, and nobody said a word about him being called Christless. James Paisley in 1788 published a book that has the weird name of Animadversions of some poet and poetasters of the present age, especially Robert Burns, and the title goes on. And in that book he called him an infidel poet and a champion of Satan. Even those who should have known better took their shots at Burns. One of them was Robert Louis Stevenson. In 1879, Robert Louis Stevenson published an article on Burns that became widely known. People thought it was great. What they don't remember is that 4 years before, in 1875, the 9th edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, the editors had asked Robert Louis Stevenson to submit an article on Burns, and he did, and it was rejected because it was a view of the poet that was too critical of Burns, and in accordance, it was not in accordance with the accepted Scottish traditions about Burns. Of the two articles, the earlier one has haunted Stevenson ever since. Now, I've been all over Scotland. Susan and I have been 15 times this past September, okay? I've never seen a statue of Stevenson. I can't tell you how many we've seen of Burns, and a few of Sir Walter Scott. Stevenson's lack of charity, and this is found in the 1947 Burns Chronicle, written by some guy named A. Angus. I don't know why they don't give the first name, but it's just A. Angus. Stevenson's lack of charity in dealing with Burns had its own retribution. As it turned out, many of his country turned against him because of that, and to some extent may be responsible for the opposition that arose to the proposal that a statue a memorial be put up to Stevenson. In an email to Alan Marchbank this week, who is the Robert Louis Stevenson Edinburgh Club Secretary, he informed me that the question of a statue among the membership is complicated and sensitive. It seems that Stevenson did not approve of statues. So what they did, and I salute them for it, they did a living memorial and collected money, and they provide funds now for children who have respiratory problems. In a little book that I just finished reading and reviewing for Electric Scotland, it's called The Edinburgh Literary Companion by Andrew Lowney. The gardens in the Princess Street area there, if you've been down there and walked toward the back, there are some birch trees there that are dedicated to to Stevenson. Now, I ran across this the other day too. How many of you ever read the book by Principal Sharp? I thought Principal Sharp with a name like that must be a woman. I'm going to find out it's a man. And I found out that he said of Holy Willie's prayer, those of us who have loved most what was best in Burns' poetry must have regretted that it was ever written. Wow. The Jolly Beggars, he said, strange not to say painful, that circumstances at the same hand which wrote the Cotter Saturday Night should have stooped to write the Jolly Beggars. So who is Burns? Let's look briefly at two men who loved and collected him. Carl Sandburg relates this story in his group of books called The Lincoln Collector. One was named Oliver Barrett, the other was Charles Gunther. Barrett saw a manuscript in the hands of Robert Burns about Auld Lang Syne. And so the conversation goes this way. Barrett, I want this Auld Lang Syne. Gunther, I know how you feel. I went over to England and I got it and I had to pay a lot of money for it. Barrett, I want it now. You know how it feels to have it, and I don't know how it feels. Gunther, I will say you this old lang syne, and you will write out a receipt that at any time I want it back, I can buy it back at the same price. Barrett bought it, took it home. A week later, he got a phone call from Gunther. Bring back old lang syne. You know I haven't been able to sleep. I hear the waves of Lake Michigan pounding at night, and I think about it. I walk down Michigan Avenue thinking about it. Now it is gone, and I'm not going to last many years. Let me have it back. So when you think of Burns, what comes to mind? Is it his love of whiskey, women, mankind, poetry, songs, his love of his children, both in and out of wedlock? For me, I can sum it up with one word: passion. Burns had passion. He had passion for all he did in life, and particularly for his poems, for his songs, his wife, his country, his whiskey, his children, his women, his fellow man, and his fellow Masons. He was passionate about everything that he did. Long ago, when the Greeks didn't write obituaries, they only asked one question: did he have passion? Well, you and I can say that Burns had passion, because it was with passion that he defied his father and took that dancing class. And if you remember, if you've read your Burns, and a few of you I assume have, that if you read it, you will see that it caused a wedge between the father and the son that even death did not remove. He was a rebel with a cause. He had a rebellious streak a mile wide, but it was with passion that he would do things like write the incendiary verses of Wallace and Bruce and the Stuarts. It was with passion that he would stand up for what he believed in. It was with passion that Burns displayed that defiant spirit that started out just by wearing his hair with a rubber band around it in the back. But never forget, no matter what he did, he always remembered who he was and who he was from. He was a man of the people. We should never forget that. While we sing, "O God Save the King," we'll no forget the people. He was what Maurice Lindsay called a people poet. It's not like it. He was a social being. He loved company. And when he went on his border tour and his Highland tour, his most important aspect was not what he wrote there, but what he put in that book when he got back home about the people that he met. Two characteristics of Burns stand out. He had a fierce love of his native land, which is every native son's dominant characteristic. You talk to Eddie, you talk to Billy, and you can find out their great love for Scotland. His love of freedom. He hated tyranny. He hated oppression. He wrote of the independence of France and America. There's no need in me repeating those stories, but he did say that regarding the American Congress in 1776, he wrote that the 4th of July will be as famous as that posterity as the 5th of November. And what was he talking about, the 5th of November? So I looked it up, and it's what? Guy Fawkes Day, okay? And what did they do? They celebrate that with bonfires and fireworks. And the big difference between the two is that we celebrate victory and they celebrate the failure. Because what he tried to do was he attempted to kill the king and parliament, to rid the country of its Protestant rulers and restore the Catholic faith. Once at a banquet, Burns was asked to drink to the health of Pitt. He replied, "I would give you a better toast, George Washington." Okay? Whispers began to abound about that and a few other things Burns did. Is he a traitor? Is he selling out? And I can only say, how dare they say that he could even be thought to be a traitor, when this author of Scott's What Hay When Wallace Bled could be called a traitor. To salute George Washington and America, he gave us a great poem, Ode to George Washington. And if you're worth your salt, next July 4th, you'll get out that dusty copy of the works of Burns, and you'll turn over there and you will read it. Now, I began my Scottish pilgrimage about 15 to 16 years ago, late in life, sadly. But once I found out about my Scottish heritage and my Scottish blood, I have tried to go full speed to make up for lost time. But I must tell you in a confession that really is nothing new, because I have always seriously considered myself an average man, and I've had to run hard all my life to catch up and to stay abreast. And I've had to run hard to catch whatever dream I was chasing or whatever devil I was fleeing. One of my passions is books. When I started my journey about Scotland, I bought books on Scotland. And in my house tonight, there's over 3,000 books on Scotland, and I devoured as many of them as I could. When I fell in love with Burns just 4 or 5 years ago and joined this August Club, notice I didn't say August Body, August Club. When I joined this group that has been so open with their arms to accept you, I fell in love with Burns. I started collecting Burns books, and I'm proud to tell you that tonight in my home there are over 900 volumes on Burns alone. I devoured them, and I read them, and I study them, and I did something this week I've never done, just to take a break from this little preparation. And I read a book by Stuart Woods called $2 Bill. And when I got through it, I said, God, what a waste. I've stood in the room in Dumfries, in that little home, wondering about this man of the people, this people poet, and could only ask, can you imagine Scotland without Burns?
No.
And can you imagine Burns without passion? No. In conclusion, there's an old Mexican tradition concerning death. It says you die 3 times. Some of you are going to die more than that. The first time you die is when you cease to breathe. The second time is when you're buried. The third and final time that you die is when your name is never mentioned or spoken again. Now think about it. Okay? That is, you still live as long as your name is spoken and remembered on earth. Do you think the name of Robert Burns will cease to be spoken or remembered? No. No way. Robert Burns will never experience the third death. And of course, by Handel are these words: his body is buried in peace, but his name lives forever. Elton John, heard him just this afternoon, played and sang at Princess Diana's funeral about Norma Jean. He said in that song, your candle burned out long ago before your legend ever did. I would have liked to have known you. And we'd all like to know Robert Burns. I look forward to meeting him one day. I'm just not in a hurry to do it. In the New Testament, in the King James Version, it says, in Hebrews, he being dead, yet speaketh. In a modern version, it says, he being dead, still speaks. The name of Robert Burns will never die. He still speaks. And so, gentlemen, it is to Robert Burns, a man of passion, a lover of freedom and independence, a master of verse and song, a man of the people, a people's poet. It is to Scotland's native son and national bard that I ask you to stand, charge your glasses. Robert Burns.
Robert. Let that enough.